Thomas Hale noticed the milestone because it was not where he expected it to be. He walked the same stretch of the old road most evenings, following a quiet section of the Fosse Way where the modern lane ran close to the Roman line but never quite overlapped it. The traffic thinned quickly once he left the town behind, and before long the road narrowed, bordered by hedges and fields that felt older than their boundaries suggested. Thomas liked the walk for its regularity. The ground underfoot was firm, the route predictable. It gave shape to the end of the day, marking time more reliably than clocks ever seemed to. The milestone stood just beyond a shallow bend. It was low and worn, its surface softened by centuries of weather. Moss gathered in its shallow grooves, blurring whatever inscription had once been cut there. Thomas had passed it many times without stopping. He could not have said what distance it marked, or even whether it marked anything at all. That evening he paused beside it without quite knowing why. The stone leaned slightly toward the road, as though listening. Thomas rested his hand on its surface. It was cool, even in summer, and faintly damp. He stood there for a moment longer than he intended, then continued on his way. The next evening, the milestone seemed closer to the bend, not much closer, just enough that Thomas noticed the difference. He told himself it was nothing. A trick of memory, perhaps, or the way the light fell at that hour, flattening distances and softening edges. He walked on, and the thought left him. But over the following days, he found himself watching for the stone. It did not move in any obvious way. It did not change position while he looked at it. Yet each time he approached, it felt as though it were meeting him sooner than before, as though the road between them had shortened. Thomas began to slow his pace as he drew near. He found that if he walked more deliberately, counting his steps without meaning to, the stone seemed to settle back into place. If he hurried, it appeared sooner. The realization was faint, half-formed, but it stayed with him. One evening, he stopped directly in front of it. The inscription was barely legible now, its edges rounded and broken. Thomas brushed away a little moss with his thumb, revealing a shallow groove that might once have been a numeral, or a mark of some other kind. He felt then a peculiar sense of attention. Not pressure, not threat, simply the awareness of being noticed. Thomas laughed quietly at himself and stepped away. That night he dreamed of roads, not of traveling them, but of standing beside them, watching others pass, men in cloaks and boots, carts creaking slowly, figures moving at different speeds, all following the same line. Some passed once, some returned again and again. The road did not change for them, it only received them. When he woke, the dream stayed with him longer than usual. Over the next weeks, the milestone became a marker in a different sense. Thomas noticed that on evenings when he felt restless or distracted, the stone seemed closer, almost eager. On nights when he walked calmly, letting his thoughts drift, it waited for him where it always had. He began to understand, without quite admitting it to himself, that the stone was not measuring distance. It was measuring return. The thought should have reassured him. Instead, it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately name. Thomas realized that return did not necessarily imply choice. The road did not ask why someone came back. It only acknowledged that they had. That night, for the first time, he wondered whether the stone counted him only when he walked, or whether it remembered him even when he stayed away. The idea felt strangely reasonable. Roman milestones, he knew, had been set to mark progress along the road, to give travelers a sense of how far they had come and how far remained. But this one had stood here for much longer than any single journey. It had watched generations pass, had felt the vibration of countless footsteps and wheels. What use would miles be to something that never moved? One evening, as dusk gathered quickly, Thomas noticed a number scratched faintly into the stone's surface. He was certain it had not been there before. It was not deeply cut nor neatly shaped. It looked more like a tally mark than a numeral, a shallow line that caught the fading light at a certain angle. Thomas leaned closer, tracing it with his eye. As he did, a quiet certainty settled over him. The mark had not been carved by hand. It had appeared. He stepped back, unsettled, then forced himself to breathe more slowly. The road lay empty in both directions. The hedges whispered faintly in the breeze. Nothing else had changed. The next evening, there were 2 marks. Thomas did not touch the stone again. Instead, he began to experiment. On some nights, he walked past the milestone without stopping, barely glancing at it. On others, he paused deliberately, standing still until the light shifted and the road grew quiet around him. The marks changed accordingly. They did not count nights, nor did they count hours. They counted arrival. Each time Thomas truly noticed the stone, each time he acknowledged it, however briefly, the tally increased. The realization did not frighten him. It made him thoughtful. He began to wonder how many times he had walked this road before the stone had begun to count him. How many passings were required before noticing became recognition. Thomas did not walk the road the following night. The weather was poor, the wind sharp enough to rattle the hedges, and he told himself there was no need to go out. Yet the decision troubled him more than it should have. He slept badly, waking more than once, with the sense of having forgotten something important. When he returned to the road the next evening, there were 3 marks on the stone. Thomas stood very still, aware that one of them did not belong to a walk he could remember taking. One evening, he arrived at the milestone and found an elderly man standing beside it. The man was not touching the stone. He stood a little way back, his hands clasped loosely behind him, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Good evening," Thomas said after a moment. The man nodded. "It's a faithful thing," he replied. Thomas hesitated. "The stone?" "Yes," the man said. "It keeps better records than we do." They stood together in silence for a while. "Does it mark distance?" Thomas asked at last. The man smiled faintly. "Not any longer." When Thomas looked again, the man had gone. The milestone remained. That night, Thomas dreamed again of roads. This time, he stood beside the stone, watching himself pass again and again. Each time he returned, the tally deepened, not as a warning, not as a judgment, simply as a record. He woke with a sense of calm acceptance. From then on, Thomas walked the Fosse Way differently. He no longer hurried. He no longer tried to predict where the milestone would appear. He accepted its presence as part of the route, no more remarkable than the bend in the road or the shape of the hedges. The tally continued to grow. Thomas did not know what would happen when the marks filled the stone, or whether such a thing was even possible. He suspected it was not meant to be reached within a single lifetime. The stone had all the time it required. Thomas understood then that the tally was not meant to be completed. It was not moving toward an end. It was simply continuing. As roads do, long after the feet that first wore them down have gone. The fear, when it came, was quiet and lasting, not of what would happen when the stone finished counting, but of what it meant that it never would. Years later, when Thomas no longer walked the road as often, the milestone remained where it had always been. Moss gathered, rain softened its edges. The tally marks blurred and faded, replaced slowly by others. And sometimes, when a familiar figure approaches along the old Roman line, the distance between road and stone seems to shorten, not to hurry them along, but to acknowledge their return. Please subscribe to this channel to be alerted to the next episode of Ghosts of the Cotswolds.